Welcome to the Awaken Campuses podcast, an ongoing conversation coming out of our young adult community about what it looks like to follow Jesus in today's cultural climate. My name is Marcus DePeel, Director of Awaken, and welcome to Season 1. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Awaken Campuses podcast. I'm Marcus DePeel, and I'm joined today by the Josh Lavender.
What is up?
It's great to have you, man. And we are just continuing this kingdom culture series that we've been working through, kind of talking about this idea of what does it look like for us as Christians to partner with the Spirit in building His culture here on earth. And just in the last episode, we talked about this principle that we call deference, Christian deference, which the idea really is to limit yourself for the sake and benefit of other people. So basically, like, limit your own freedom for the sake of others. And kind of a touchy topic and not talked about a ton in many church circles. And this episode's actually going to be a little bit more of the same in terms of touchy topics.
Let's go.
Today we're going to look at this idea and principle of the kingdom culture called Christian submission. And even the moment I know that I say the word submission or people read it as they start to play this episode, your skin starts crawling a little bit. Like, I don't like this idea. I don't like this word. And we're going to spend some time unpacking not what we think it means necessarily, but even what does the scripture have to say about it. And when we talked about this on all of our campuses, we taught from Ephesians chapter 5. And the book of Ephesians as a whole, and specifically chapter 5, are pretty well known by scholars of being like this chapter or this book of the DNA of Christian culture. So this is like what Christians do, what they don't do. This is who Christians are. Even this is who the church is. This is what they look like and how they function and all that good stuff. And so Ephesians 5, 1 to 21, in many ways are like a roadmap of like what should Christians do, how should we live. And verse 21 in particular is where we start to get into the submission conversation. And the verse 21, we're going to read it here in just a second, but the verse 21 oftentimes gets lumped with the rest of chapter 5, which starts to get into the, like how household relationships should play themselves out and things like that. So wives, submit to your husbands and all of this. But verse 21 actually, many commentators would argue, goes better with the front half of Ephesians chapter 5 and all the different commands and ways of living that Christians are called to live into. So we'll unpack that more, obviously, in a little bit. But why don't we go ahead and you even just read like the end of that passage, Ephesians 5, 1 to 21.
For sure. I'll read verses 15 through 21. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another with psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit. Sing and make music from your hearts to the Lord, always giving thanks to God the Father for everything in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ.
That's right. And so, again, Paul is ending that kind of first section of this chapter 5, putting a bow on everything he has said by saying, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And we're going to spend this whole episode unpacking what exactly did he mean by that. But as we look at Ephesians chapter 5 from big picture perspective, and, again, this is the DNA of like Christian culture, all of that stuff, just even want to begin. And one of the first things like we talked about on our campuses as well is that from that big picture, like 30,000 foot view looking at it, is Paul's getting at this idea that there is a right way to live. Like there's actually a correct way that in which we should live. And in our culture, that's like not a popular thing to say at all. Like truth, according to the West, is very subjective. So you decide, like you define your own truth, basically. You think truth is this. I think truth is this. and we're supposed to just be okay with one another thinking truth is like something else. And so I don't know how that works. That's got to break down at many different points along the way. But as a Christian, what Paul is saying is like there really is a right way to live, and it echoes the words of Jesus from John 14 that many of us know well, where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life.
Yeah.
No one comes to the Father except through me, is what Jesus is saying. So even the Messiah, the Son of God himself, is saying like, man, truth is not subjective. There is a right way to live, and the right way to live and the objective truth is all found in me, the person of Jesus. But even as we say these words as a right way to live, like, again, a lot of people in our culture would not love that idea. That would be very countercultural for even where we're at. So what even comes to your mind first off, like when we think about this idea of there being a right or a correct way to live in the first place?
Yeah, I think when I hear, and maybe a lot of people hear a right way to live, maybe they think in their minds like the parent that tells their kid, you need to do this, and the kid's like, why? And they go, because I said so.
Because I said so.
Like, it seems like when we say there's a right way to live is there's no reason for that. It's just right. Yeah. Like no reason, just do it. And I think it is more helpful to start this conversation talking about like, why is it the right way?
Yeah.
And I think that can often lead us into wanting to do things the right way and
the
wanting
why
to
the
follow.
what.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's an important thing to just talk about the why. And so I guess for me, thinking a little bit about the why Paul is giving us these commands and these directions as Christians, I think of it like God's own life, his favor, his blessing, his peace. Like his own life is like a river or a stream moving in a certain direction.
Yeah.
And as we move with him, we experience peace and life and joy, and we experience satisfaction and contentment.
Right.
But it would be like you moving against a river, like trying to go upstream when we do things that are contrary to what God desires or the people God made us to be.
Yeah.
So we're doing things contrary to our own design and our own purpose. And when we do that, we experience fear and scarcity and pain. And like we experience, not that there's not pain, in God's way either. The Christian life doesn't absolve us from experiencing pain.
Right.
But I'm just saying there are types of pain that we do bring upon ourselves by living in a way that God hasn't intended.
Yeah.
And so I guess that's the way that I think of it, is God is giving us, Paul is giving us directions or ways that we can live in God's own life and his own joy and peace and rest.
Yeah. Something I love that's even in there, that everything you just said, is when Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. Like we would advocate there is a right way to live. Yeah. There is objective truth. But I love how Jesus even saves for the end out of the way, the truth, and the life. He saves the fact that he is the life for the end in this. So he's saying there's a right way, there's objective truth, but the right way and the objective truth lead to life.
Yes.
And so it's even what you're saying is I think it's God's desire for us, his creation, to participate in his life. So it's not just right because I said so, but it's right because it brings you into the love and the joy and the peace and the goodness of God that he desperately wants you to be a part of.
That he made you for.
Yeah. And so it's not just right because it's right because it's good for you. Like he's for you in all of that. And so again, thinking back to Ephesians 5 from the big picture perspective, Paul's instructing us how to live, which most of that comes from how Christ himself and the Lord and the old covenant has instructed us to live. A lot of that kind of mashed into one. And he's saying things like there must be no sexual immorality, no greed, no foolish talk, coarse joking, drunkenness, all this. And I love the way that it's all prefaced in Ephesians chapter 5. In verses 1 to 2, he says this. Paul says, "Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." So not only is this the right way to live, and it's good for us because ultimately it leads to life, but it's the right way to live, and we have like the perfect model of this life. And I don't remember if it was you or another one of our good friends that said this to me one time, but I just think this idea is incredible, that there's nothing that God asks or requires of us that he has not already been willing to do himself. So anything that we're instructed to do as a follower of Christ is only something that he's already been willing to do for us to begin with. So again, there is this right way to live, and it's in the truth and the ways and the nature and the life ultimately of God himself. Kind of turning the conversation to the next thing I know we want to talk about, and we'll spend even more time on this one, is that when we hear that word submission in our culture, it's very easy for us immediately to have that like negative, averse reaction to it. Like, oh, I don't really like where this is going. Submission hasn't been good for me in the past, or whatever the case might be there. And we have this natural inclination and reaction to believe that submission subtracts from different parts of our lives. And we want to advocate today, and when we talked with our students and young adults on our campuses, like, we advocate for this idea that submission to the ways of the Lord don't subtract from your life. They actually like multiply. Submission doesn't subtract, it multiplies. It's like the narrative that we want to bring to that, because often we think submission subtracts primarily from two different things, that it subtracts from our uniqueness as maybe an individual, and it subtracts from our freedom and our ability to like be in control and go our own way. And so when you think of like the natural inclination for us to think submission subtracts, maybe even starting with our uniqueness, like, why do we think that, and what does that mean? And maybe unpack that for us a bit.
I think part of it has to do with like our own desires, that in our culture we really like authenticity is a buzzword, you know. I just want to be authentic. I just want to be real. And like, we feel like if we're denying what we want, if we're denying our desires, then we're not being our authentic selves. So this means to be your authentic self, you have to follow everything you desire, which is kind of a scary, thought that if everybody does that, what a messed up world we're in.
I know.
But it's the idea that autonomy, like me going my own way, forging my own path, is my true, identity, that this is who I really am. And if I deny any of that, then I'm losing my identity. I'm losing who I am. And I'm just, maybe submitting or molding into who somebody else is. And so it can feel like a loss of our uniqueness, like you said, or our identity. And, I know that's not, God's way, his way. We become more ourselves when we actually participate in his ways and in community, and because he's teaching us, again, who we've been designed to be. But that's not how it feels, and that's not the cultural narrative.
The cultural narrative, maybe best summed up in my mind, that we're given is, I don't actually know, so if you want to like research and YouTube this, maybe I'm totally wrong on which brand or whatever, but I remember this commercial I watched, and I think it was like an Apple commercial or something like that, where everyone is there. There's like a huge street and tons of people walking down the street, all in the same direction, and they're like wearing the same colored shirt, and they're using like this really old, boring product. So if it's an Apple commercial, probably like a BlackBerry, right? They have this old phone in their hand, and they're all walking the same direction, same colored shirt, and then you see this one person with this different colored shirt on. So everyone's wearing like dark gray, and they come out in this like light blue or yellow, like very highlighter looking shirt with the new product, the new phone. And the whole message you get is like, you need to like walk against the grain and go against everyone else and be unique and express yourself, and the self-actualization of the individual and all this stuff. And it feels like the message we get over and over again is you need to be unique in such a way that you're doing something so different and separate from everyone else. And like, that's how you express yourself or become fully yourself. And the narrative I think that we're trying to bring is, and what really Scripture's trying to bring, is that you become most yourself in Christian community. Like, you become most uniquely you in the ways of the Lord. Like, that's when you actually become yourself fully. So if you're after uniqueness, like, submission to the Lord doesn't subtract. It multiplies and helps you discover that uniqueness in the first place.
To like maybe compare and contrast. Like, the first one I think of is I have to follow my own desires. And I have to go with what I want in order to find who I truly am and be who I truly am.
Right.
And then so that's kind of maybe a cultural narrative.
Mhm.
And then the Lord's way is like, I am going to show you through my commands, my limitations, my ways, who you were designed to be.
Right.
So I'm going to show you who you're designed to be and what will fulfill you the most. Another one might be like the commercial that you just mentioned, like all these people, same color clothing, walking in the same direction, and then one person, they have the new product, and they're different color clothing. So I have to go against or be different from what everyone else is doing in order to have a real strong sense of identity.
Right.
I have to be different from everyone else in order to be unique.
Yep.
Like, this is where I'm finding that. Where I think the more Christian way is, I think it was C.S. Lewis who talked about one of his friends who passed away, and he was saying, I will never have that part of me that my friend brought out again.
Yeah. Oh,
so
yeah.
he was just saying, like, in a group of friends, each one is bringing out something different of me.
Yeah.
And if one of them is gone, that part of me lies dormant. Like, that part of me will never come out again.
Yeah.
So, like, the Christian view of this is not I have to be different from everybody else in order to be unique, but each person brings out something unique in me.
Yeah. That's a beautiful perspective where, again, your most unique self, your truest self, is going to be found in Christian community, found in the church, and found in the ways of Jesus. So, yes, we think submission naturally will subtract from our uniqueness. It's not true. It multiplies it. And the same is true, I think, when we talk about the idea of freedom as well. So, my parents well, so you know probably where I'm going with this. But my parents, I grew up in a house that had a bunch of like tiny little funny rules, right? We had the normal ones that I was not like oppressed as a child or anything. I had a great childhood. My parents are awesome. But I had the normal rules standard of, you need to be in bed by like 9:30 or something like
Classic.
that. Although my dad would let me stay up if he was watching a game and didn't want to watch it alone. He'd let me sit down with him and do that. But we had the classic, I would get picked up by my mom from school, and I'd always want like chicken nuggets from McDonald's or something like that. And she would always hit me with no, Marcus, we have food at home. And it was like, I don't like the food at home. I don't want the food at home, right? But then we had funny ones where I wasn't allowed to have like food in my room. And so I got really creative. I would take like a box of Cheez-Its and I would hide it between like my bed and the wall.
Wow.
I'd try and hide it in there. And
You
then
would.
my dad would go in and still find that and the Little Debbie's and Pop-Tarts next to it and stuff like that. I would try, man. I really would. And then other rules like, you couldn't put a glass on the coffee table without a coaster because it might leave a little ring on the wood, and you can't have that. And then the real kicker for me was, not this one, but I had a 30-minute video game limit. Could only play 30 minutes a day. That one was tough.
That's
and then the kicker was when you would go down to the basement and you would use a blanket, you weren't allowed to leave the basement without folding the blanket back up and putting it back in the blanket basket where it went, and then double checking to make sure you didn't move around all the decorative pillows. And if you did, they had to go right back in the perfect spot so that it was ready for the next person to come into the room when you were done.
You know what I have to say? I have to say shout out to Ken and Karen, because we live together and there are no stray blankets, bro. The blankets are all put back every night.
That's exactly right.
Praise
and
God.
that's right where I'm heading, because I thought as a kid that all these rules were like subtracting from my freedom, and it was so tough, and I had the worst childhood ever because I had to use a coaster and fold the blankets. And now I look at all these rules my parents gave me and I think about what they actually did for me. They did not subtract from my freedom long term.
They made you a better housemate.
They made me a better housemate, hopefully a better future husband, like all of the above, a better child at the time, I think, although I probably did revolt and rebel a little bit. But the bottom line is, like, they made me more responsible. Yeah. So going to bed on time and having a bedtime teaches you, like, you're going to have more energy the next day because you went to sleep. Not eating McDonald's and chicken nuggets every day, which nobody still knows. The jury is still out on what those are made out of, right? We're still unaware.
We are unaware.
I still think they're good, but that's another conversation.
They are good.
Eating McDonald's every day, I don't want to know how much I would weigh if I didn't eat the food at home. I'd have no money in my bank account if I didn't eat the food at home. It's cheaper. Playing only 30 minutes of video games a day, things like that, putting limits on it prevents like just frying your brain in front of a screen, right? Folding the blankets. It may, like, I actually can have people over and not be like, oh no, the house is a mess. It's like, oh, it's trash. It's like, no, it looks great because I'm OCD now.
Yep.
Thanks, Dad. Like, I appreciate, I
Thanks,
genuinely appreciate it. No sarcasm attached, which is actually slightly annoying that I appreciate it as much as I do for how much I hated it as like a 13-year-old. But I thought all these like rules and regulations and all this kind of stuff was like making my life more difficult and subtracting from my freedom. And I realize now at the wise age of 24 years old.
The ripe age of 24.
Yes, I know no, I don't know anything, it feels like. But I realize now that these things were ultimately for my good.
Yeah.
And I think this idea really of freedom is so important. And as we turn that even to like what Christian freedom actually should look like, there's no better place to even find that than in Galatians chapter 5, where Paul is writing to the church of Galatia. He says this. He says, "You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free." So freedom is a very central part of the Christian life, according to the Apostle Paul. He says, "But do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command, love your neighbor as yourself. If you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. So I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other," then he says, "so that you are not to do whatever you want." So it's in the scriptures that as Christians, we're not supposed to just do whatever we want.
Yeah.
Like, that's not what freedom actually means. So then the question, I guess, would be like, what is Christian freedom? Like, when we say submission doesn't subtract from freedom, it multiplies it, then what is freedom? Like, what's being multiplied?
I know a couple podcasts ago, I think we went into this idea a little more, but we differentiated just the difference between freedom of like having any choice that you want and like freedom in the heart. There was a way that you said it. Yeah,
just exactly that. It's not about Christian freedom is not freedom of choice. It's freedom of heart.
Yeah. So it's Christian freedom is not that we are unlimited or we can choose literally anything we want. We have no restraint, but it's about having freedom from shame, having freedom to feel peace, having freedom to be at rest, having freedom to feel joy and contentment, and really things that we were designed to feel and to know, and the people that we were designed to be. It's that kind of a freedom, not I have the freedom to do anything I want to do.
Right.
So I think when we use the word freedom kind of in a cultural sense, people mean I am free to make this choice or that choice, or even I'm free to do things that are going to wreck me. You know, I'm free to drink as much as I want, or just binge as much as I want, or I'm free to like hurt other people, which really that's not what we're talking about with Christian freedom. In Christian freedom, we might actually limit our choices. We limit our like ability to do certain things or things we might even want. We may limit that in order to experience freedom spiritually, in order to experience peace, in order to experience what we would call life to the full, the fruit of the Spirit.
Yeah. So because we think freedom is best defined as freedom of choice, we think that the boundaries of God are like directly opposed to our freedom.
Yes.
But when we start to define freedom as freedom of heart, we see the boundaries of God actually as something that benefit our freedom and literally multiply our freedom. Like his boundaries are just heaping freedom all upon me because I don't have shame. I'm not going against the grain of the river that you were talking about earlier. I'm actually flowing in God's goodness and his peace and all of that. So when we start to think about some of the boundaries that Paul is giving in Ephesians 5, no hint of sexual immorality, no hint of greed, no coarse joking, not getting drunk on wine. We start to see these as boundaries that they're not opposed to our freedom. They're actually like multiplying our freedom. So like, how do these things and these commands and these boundaries Paul is giving us, like, how are those like actually multiplying our freedom?
Well, I think a cool way of viewing this, and obviously Paul is doing that, is not just individually. So far we've been talking about it mostly individually, like, you know, I'm going to experience peace or I'm going to experience whatever. But I think like God has in mind communities and his people, and Paul has in mind this group of people, and what is going to happen with them. I know the passage you just read earlier is what it looks like when we don't follow God's freedom and his limitations. We bite and devour one another.
Yeah.
And I think this is part of what Paul is prohibiting and saying don't do. So like I think of sexual immorality, like using other people or wanting to take from other people,
Right.
not discerning the image of God in other people. So I know we see this really clearly in the sex trafficking industry, the sex trade, like prostitution, and a lot of those areas. We see people being dehumanized. They're objectified, treated as objects rather than people. And this is so opposite of God's design, because God wants us to see Jesus in each other.
Right.
So he even gives us that image where Jesus is the person who, I was naked and you clothed me. I was thirsty, you gave me. He is the needy one in another person. And so, I mean, it's a sacramental way of thinking to look at another person and say, this person is Jesus.
Yeah.
Or they have the image of God. Or like the fingerprint of God is on every other person that you see.
Yeah.
And what this would cause us to do is the opposite of sexual immorality. It would cause us to treat people with honor, and respect, and say this person has so much value.
Yeah.
I've heard it said before, it might actually be C.S. Lewis, that in pornography, you're not seeing too much of another person. You're actually seeing too little.
Wow.
Wow. You're not able to discern that person in like with the image of God and with the value that they have if you are just treating them as an object for your own gratification, your own pleasure, your own selfishness.
Yeah. Man, that's powerful. And looking at these boundaries and these, yes, they're commands, but ultimately they're boundaries for our good that Paul gives. And you just look at the fruit of things like sexual immorality and the mistrust and anxiety. I mean, confusion it brings on people that experience it, right? Or no hint of greed. Like the fruit of greed is, I don't ever have enough.
Yeah.
I always need more. Scarcity. The fruit of coarse joking is a community that doesn't build each other up, but that tears each other down because somebody's the brunt of a joke.
Biting and devouring.
Absolutely. Getting drunk on wine. It's like, what good has drunkenness brought into this world ever? I think of drunk driving. I think of abusive like spouses or parents because they come home drunk and they're alcoholics. It's like, they're not said like, hey, you can't do whatever you want. It's like, man, this actually is the most free life. Like the ways of Jesus are the most free life. They're not just this is what some old Bible says. It's like, this is actually the best thing for your heart. You were created for that freedom.
Yes, we turn to things in order to feel some kind of maybe coping or reprieve from pain or difficult feelings or whatever. And so I know that's what even counselors will talk about substance abuse as like self-medicating often, where it's like, I'm going to turn to this. And God would teach us in his community to not turn to those things, but instead turn and lean into Christian brothers and sisters, to lean into his word and his spirit, to lean into worship, to lean into things that will be actually a better coping mechanism and in fact a healing mechanism. And so God is like teaching us not to bite and devour one another, not to create communities that are based on harming one another, but communities that are based on healing and helping. Just one last image I think of with that, Steve Deneff in one of his books, I think it's the 7 Graces for the 7 Deadly Sins, but he says lust would pick the flower even if it kills the plant.
Wow.
And I think that's a great image for the kind of attitude Paul wants us to stay away from. Is like being so selfish that we would consider our own desire, even if it would harm a person around us.
Wow.
Even if it would destroy community, break trust, that we would still go after what we want.
Yeah. So submission doesn't subtract. It multiplies. It actually makes us better. The fruit is better. And what you just said is, I think, a perfect segue into maybe the turn we want to make in the conversation. And we'll kind of wrap everything up with this idea that in the first 20 verses of Ephesians chapter 5, Paul is outlining again the cultural DNA of Christianity for followers of Jesus in this way. And in verse 21, he kind of just throws this left hook, it feels like, the knockout punch of all of it, where he says, now, like, after all of this has been said, I want you to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. It's kind of like, could you have just said that verse 1 so we could have gotten it out of the way and I could have dealt with it and been fine? But the reality is, like, that is where he wants us to land. And again, we said at the very beginning, when we hear the word submission, so many of us have like a negative reaction to it. It frustrates us, or it reminds us of a negative experience, or whatever the case is. And I think we have to ask the obvious question of like, how come? Like, why do we feel that way? And there's a great quote from a commentator named Maxie Dunham on Ephesians 5 and submission. And he says this. He says, again, perverted and damaging expressions of submission have occurred. Unfortunately, the fact is that most of us have been exposed to such a limited or mutilated form of biblical submission that we have either embraced a deformity of the real thing, or we have rejected the discipline altogether. Embraced a deformity of the real thing, or rejected the discipline altogether. What I think he's getting at here is an idea that we see Christian submission as something with only two different outcomes. We see it as a fork in the road of it's either this one or it's this one. So our response to it is, okay, I just have to lay down and become a doormat and let everyone walk over me. Like, that's what submission is. Or we see it as something where it's like, maybe we think it's that, and so our response would be the exact opposite of, I refuse to lay down and be a doormat, and I just reject the idea, and I'm going to be my own boss and be in control and be in charge because I don't like what Christian submission means or requires of me. And I think what Maxie Dunham is getting at is that neither of those are real Christian submission. To reject the idea is obviously not, and to just become a doormat additionally is not Christian submission. So it begs the question for us in our conversation, like, what is real Christian submission?
Yeah. Well, I think what's happened, first off, is, like, I don't know if you've heard of the term anchoring, but like, we can anchor a word or an image or something with good feeling, bad feeling, or another word or image or whatever. And that's like most of what marketing is trying to do is like anchor a cologne with like being attractive, or maybe a clothing line with acceptance and friendship, whatever. I think what's happened is we have anchored submission with oppression.
Wow.
So when we say the word submission, we think oppression.
Wow.
So like, if I submit, it means I'm going to get wrecked, trampled, abused, oppressed.
Yes.
And I know that there's a lot of people who feel that with, even politically, with structures. If you tell me like I am this, then you are oppressing me. Or if you tell me, and some people even with gender, if you tell me I'm a guy or a girl, like you're oppressing me. So what we've done, I think, is anchor submission with oppression. And I think the truth is, that's not what it is at all.
Right.
It is a potential. Like, so in any community, there is potential for oppression.
Yeah.
But that is not what true Christian submission is. So you ask the question, what is it? I think, honestly, if we were to see a community that is functioning in Christian submission, and I would say that is mutual submission. So not just one submitting to one other, but mutually submitting to each other out of love and reverence for Christ, I think all of us would want to be a part of a community like that.
Yeah.
Because what we would see is people honoring one another above themselves. We would see people laying down their preferences so that others are taken care of. We would see people truly showing love in ways that are self-sacrificial.
Yeah.
And all of us want that.
Yeah. I think that's exactly like what we're trying to get at here with Christian submission too, is it's not this miserable thing we just have to accept because that's what we're commanded to do. But again, it's like, I think if we were to see the real picture of what it looked like, which we actually do see that as we look at the Trinity, as we look at the Father, Son, and Spirit, always mutually deferring and mutually submitted to one another, it is the most attractive kind of community out there. And there's a commentator who talks about mutual submission this way. He kind of says like what it's not before he gets to what it is. He says mutual submission will not allow us to promote ourselves and our own interests, but neither does it make us doormats to be used by others. Legitimate submission, he says, cannot be coerced. It assumes that everyone in the community is supported and enhanced. It assumes that everyone in the community is supported and enhanced. Where that does not take place, a person will have to be wise enough to discern whether to forego their own rights or seek justice. So not this, well, I'm just going to go all the way over here. It's black and white. I'm going to go to this side. Not just it's black and white. I'm going to go to this extreme. But this wise, like navigating, I'm going to find the middle ground here. He goes on to say that Christ's pattern, Jesus' pattern of self-giving love, does not mean that we can never seek justice for ourselves. Jesus did not acquiesce to Herod or the Pharisees, and Paul did not hesitate to defend himself or speak strongly to the Galatians or Corinthians. Submission will mean that even in seeking justice, we are motivated by love for others in the community rather than by love of self.
Yeah.
I think this is a really important distinction to make, that submission is not like I lay down, I give up my rights all the time and get trampled.
Yeah.
But submission, even when it's not good for you, even if like you're wondering, how do I know if I'm being taken advantage of? How do I know if this is becoming oppressive? That there are times where you have to even probably seek godly counsel and ask the question with wisdom, saying, should I forego my own rights and just submit and allow whatever's happening to happen? Or is this a wise time for me to seek justice in this situation? Like, am I being taken advantage of? Yeah. It's probably another Christian that you're even like talking about in this scenario. So it's like, do I need to hold this person accountable? Like, are they loving me well? Maybe they are being oppressive, and I need to stand up for myself, not selfishly, but even because I want what's better for them too. Yeah. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Man, I think what you said about just all or nothing is so true, that wisdom is not, all or nothing. It's not a light switch. Wisdom is not like, oh, I have to completely just lay down and die, or I have to just totally seek my own rights all the time. Like, it's not that. Wisdom is the hard work of finding, like, in what situation, like, what is the right approach in this situation that's before me, which might be different from the approach
it's not
in
always
this
a perfect
situation.
Formula.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to change day to day and situation to situation. What's the right answer? So, like,
that's good.
The situation you're experiencing right now may be, you need to listen. And so, like, maybe to make this really real, like, say you're in an accountability group or a small group or a church, and people are coming to you and saying, hey, I see something that you don't see. Like, I know a guy who his accountability group told him that he was traveling too much and that he wasn't spending enough time with his family. And he's like, no, I'm not. Wow. He didn't see it. Yeah. And they told him, you need to stop traveling and spend time with your family. And that was a hard decision for him to say, I'm going to submit to that and listen to that, even though I don't see it. So what he had to do is say, I trust you that you see something I don't. Wow. And I'm going to listen to that. So he chose, okay, I'm going to, submit and listen to this. But there may be a situation where, you're asked to do something and you're like, that isn't actually right. This is not a right situation. So you would want to say, I'm going to seek justice in this or get other counsel or talk it through, Yep. So wisdom is very needed in this. But I guess right now, even talking about this, I am very aware of the people who maybe they have come into a accountability group, small group, or a church and felt like they were oppressed or they were treated wrongly. Yeah. And maybe that like initial desire in them or response in them is like, never again. Wow. I don't want anything to do with this. I don't want anything to do with this group. Absolutely. And I think that can rise up in any of us is like, I've been treated wrongly. I've been oppressed. Never again. Yeah. But the sad part to me is like, if we take that response, then we're shutting off the possibility to experience this life-giving community of love that we all want. where people are taking care of us and loving us. And I think we all want that in such a deep way. It's just a sad, possibility and reality for people who maybe have stepped away from that and feel like they can't go back.
Man, I think that's so good. And the reality is, when we experience things like that, our natural response often as humans is to like just build these walls and these defenses to make sure that no one can do it to me again. And what you said is exactly right, that as I build these walls and these defenses to make sure that no one can harm me in that way, what I'm also doing that I'm probably unaware of is I'm building walls and defenses that literally are stopping love from coming into my life. And it's inhibiting my ability to receive love from other people because I'm no longer willing to trust. And I'm no longer willing to be in relationship where someone else could harm me, because good relationship and real love is vulnerability and putting yourself in positions where it could go poorly.
I wonder, honestly, if we could even take a minute and pray for anybody who might be in that situation listening to this podcast, because I know that's a really real thing. Maybe people who have been hurt by the church or people who call themselves Christians that weren't acting very Christ-like. Could we just take a second and maybe pray for them?
Yeah, I think that'd be great. Why don't you just go ahead and lead us in prayer for that?
God, we just recognize the reality that so many people have been hurt inside of the church and by people who claim your name and maybe don't do things that you would have done. And so we just ask, even right now, anybody who's listening to this podcast who feels like they've been wounded or hurt by the church or a small group or accountability group or another Christian, Lord, we pray that your Spirit would bring healing and help, and that your Spirit would just reach into those areas, Lord, and that you would show who you truly are. We pray that your love would overcome even people who have misrepresented you. And I know many of us, I've been guilty of misrepresenting you for sure. And so just on behalf of you, we would reach out to those people and ask, Lord, that your Spirit would reach out to those people. And anybody listening to this who feels like that's them, we pray, Lord, that you would just touch them even right now, and that you would maybe awaken a new hope in them, that they can experience that kind of love and that kind of community. And just because that hurt and that pain has happened before doesn't mean that has to be every experience, and doesn't mean that speaks for who you are. So we pray, Lord, that you would just bring redemption in the hearts of people who have been hurt, and we ask for healing also. And we pray that new maybe vision of hope would just be rekindled in their hearts for a community that loves and accepts them, that that wall would be able to come down and they would be able to sense your Spirit and your church inviting them. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Thanks for leading us in that, man. Just say a couple quick concluding thoughts, and then I think we can be done. Even to just kind of end on a note like that would be good. Just wrapping up the thought of what Christian submission is. There's a commentator that puts it this way. He says, it is the self-giving love, humility, and willingness to die that are demanded of all Christians. For example, in Philippians 2:3, Paul rejects selfishness and asks that in humility people consider others as quote-unquote surpassing themselves. Pretty much in short, Christian submission really is the willingness to actually value others above yourself, to actually do it and actually mean it and actually think that way. Because what comes into my mind, and we will land here and be done, is in this hyper individualistic culture that we live in, the temptation to always think of yourself first and be the biggest advocate for your own hopes and dreams and aspirations and the life that you want, and you're the one looking out for yourself the most, that kind of culture and society. What ends up happening is it means that you have one advocate for yourself if everyone's doing that. There's one person advocating for my hopes and my dreams and my aspirations and my finances, and you go down the list. There's one person advocating for me. In a mutually submissive culture, which is meant to be called the church, that's what we're supposed to be. What it would look like is if everyone said, I'm going to put other people first and trust that I will be taken care of by the Lord and through the other people in this community. Instead of having one advocate for your own life and for your own hopes and your dreams and aspirations, you would end up having, think about a small group. Instead of one advocate, you'd have 10.
Yep.
Instead of one person pushing for that calling you feel like God has really placed on your life, you would have, 10 plus people pushing for your calling just as much, if not more, than you would of yourself. It is like unbelievable how much better we are together in a mutually submitted community, and that is the point of the church.
We all want that.
It's what you said earlier, that if we saw what it looked like, we'd all want it. We'd all want it. And I think the lie that we hear from the enemy in all of this is, because again, we have to be very aware and cognizant, like we have an enemy and an adversary that wants us to not step into the fullness of the life that God offers us. And I think the lie that we hear from the enemy is, okay, if I choose to live this way, what if nobody else does? Like, if I choose to live this way, no one will actually end up taking care of me. I'll be so concerned with everyone else and no one will actually reciprocate that and be concerned with me. And I think as a Christian, maybe the right response and attitude for us to have in that is, number one, if that happens, like let's play out the worst case scenario where you are always caring about others and people are not doing that for you, we have an opportunity to identify with the Lord in a way that is so special, because was that not his life while he was incarnate? Like while he was here on earth, was that, still is, but like, was that not his experience? And we get to identify with him. And I would actually believe that we get to have like a certain degree of like union and communion with God in that suffering that would be so beyond what other people can even experience, because we would be identifying with him in his sufferings. Additionally, I think the way we counteract that lie of the enemy is just to simply say, in the boldness and courage that is found in the Spirit of God, like somebody has to choose to live that way first for the community to live that way altogether. And my question for anyone listening, for us sitting here right now, is, do we have the boldness and the courage to say, even if no one else lives that way, I'll live that way first? Like, I'll step out in my family or my community or my church, and I will live with an others focus, mutually submitted to other people. I'll do it first, even if nobody else does. Because the reality is, I think this is something that you've even said with all your worship study background, is that Christ is the initiator of everything. That we do not have to really do anything first, because there's one that has gone before us and shown us the way. And the reality is, like, Christ has already done this and lived this way. We just have to follow in his footsteps. So even as we think of us doing it first in our community, the truth is, no, we're not. We're going second, because there's one that's gone before us, and we get to look at him and live like him. And so I would just challenge anyone listening in your community, your immediate family, whatever the case is, would you be willing just to live this way first and to trust God in that? Josh, thanks for being here today, man. I love just this. I know it's a touchy topic, submission, but I hope even today, if you're listening or watching, that this was able to just even put the heart of God like all over and around this word submission. And you might just have a better picture of even his heart for you and all of that. Again, this has been the Awaken Campuses podcast. We are crazy passionate about seeing all of our listeners transformed by God, connected to the church, and sent into the world. So even specifically, if you're watching right now or you're listening, would encourage you, like, please don't just listen to a podcast, but get plugged into Christian community where this stuff gets fleshed out, where this stuff becomes real and gets teeth to it. So get plugged in. Even if it's not one of our communities, just find a church, get plugged into a group of people. We would love to see you do that. And thank you so much for tuning in. We'll have more great stuff coming up soon. Excited about that. Josh will be back for sure in the near future, and can't wait to just continue this conversation with all of you. So stay safe in the midst of all the virus stuff going on right now, and we will see you soon. God bless.